Acing your WAEC and NECO examinations has been made easy by the Lagos State Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education with the Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO Candidates television program. Join seasoned teachers as they take you through these core subjects, targeting the exact syllabus of WAEC and NECO. Watch Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates through these social media platforms to access more educational content and give their feedback. Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates. Pass your examinations with flying colors.
Dear students, you are welcome to Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates. We are talking economics, and in this session, we'll be looking at the analysis of the indifference curve, which is the basis for the ordinal approach to the marginal utility theory of utility maximization. Let's go. In this session, you will learn to be able to identify and define indifference curves, an indifference curve, and to also be able to explain the properties of indifference curve. And then you will learn to explain the concept of utility maximization using indifference curve, which is the ordinal approach. And finally, you'll be able to explain the introduction of the income limit or budget constraint to utility maximization. What is an indifference curve? It is a locus of points which show the different combinations of two commodities, X and Y, among which the consumer is indifferent. Or in other words, the combination of two commodities that give the consumer equal utility, or from which the consumer derives equal utility. The indifference curve render equal utility to the consumer all along the curve at different points. No matter the point you talk about, the combination of goods at that point of X and Y, say rice and beans, or bread and coffee, or yam and potatoes, depending on the combination of goods you are looking at. At different points on the indifference curve, the consumer enjoys equal utility, and therefore it is said to provide iso utility, and so known as the iso, also known as the iso utility curve. When you have a number of indifference curves, it is referred to as an indifference map. So on the same graph, you can have different indifference curves. Now we look at the properties so that we understand why we can have more than one indifference curve together, or why we have indifference maps. Now, properties of an indifference curve. We are using two indifference curves, IC1 and IC2. Indifference curves are downward sloping. This is because of the assumption of non-cessation. What does this mean? Non-cessation means that as you continue to consume different amounts or additional amounts of a commodity, you are getting lower and lower or lesser and lesser satisfaction. So satisfaction continues as you increase the number of your consumption one at a time. The indifference curve represents the higher indifference curve. So the indifference curve IC2 presents a situation of higher satisfaction than the indifference curve IC1. So if we took this point, for instance, if we took this point that crosses the two indifference curves and then connect them to the two commodities, okay, at point A, or let's call it point P, Y1, let's call it Y1. At point Y1, which intersects, so let's do it this way. Let's go this way. Since we already have certain points, so let's make use of those points. So let's make use of point A that is already here. All right? So at point A, let's call this Y1, X1. And then let's call this point A prime and call this X2. So what we are saying is that at point A, Y1 of good Y and X1 of good X are the combinations that give satisfaction to this consumer. But at a higher indifference curve, A prime at this point, Y1 and X2 give the consumer satisfaction. You will notice that at point A prime, the consumer is able to consume or derive utility or satisfaction by consuming more units of good X or commodity X. Therefore, we say that the higher the indifference curve, the higher the level of satisfaction to the consumer. Now, indifference curves can never intersect. They don't cross each other. They are convex to the origin. This is because two goods cannot be perfect substitutes of one another. All right? Perfect substitutes means even if they are substitutes, they don't give equal satisfaction. And this is essentially because of the fact that satisfaction is basically a psychological feeling. So even if commodity X can be consumed in place of commodity Y as a substitute, it doesn't mean that both of them will give the exact same satisfaction. And that is why the indifference curve shows that very clearly by being convex to the origin. And the origin here is 0. Now, the essence of the difference curve analysis is to describe or explain maximization, utility maximization, using the ordinal approach, where utility is said not to be measured, not to be possible to measure, but can rather be ranked. Okay? So, under the ordinal approach, using the indifference curve, consumer will reach equilibrium point or will achieve utility maximization at the highest level of satisfaction given all constraints. That's at the highest point of your indifference curve. So if you have the indifference curve, as we saw earlier, if we have an indifference curve, this is what this means. If we have this indifference curve showing combinations of A and B, two commodities, that is to be consumed from which we want to derive satisfaction. At this point, we have this combination. Let's call this combination A1 and B1. At this point, we have another combination A2 and B2. At this point, we have another combination, all touching the indifference curve, combination A3 and B3. We are saying that irrespective of whichever point we are, X, Y, Z. So long as it's along the indifference curve, then we are getting the same level of satisfaction. Now, to increase the level of satisfaction, we would have to move to a higher level of or a higher indifference curve, which will give us at the same point here, say X. For us to get a higher satisfaction, we have to go to another indifference curve. But at this point, we cannot get any better satisfaction on this line if we are at this point. To get a better satisfaction or a higher satisfaction, it has to be that we are on another indifference curve, which would now give us like this, and then let's call this point X prime, and will give us B2 prime. So to get a higher satisfaction, it has to be on a higher indifference curve. That is the point that we are trying to make here. Then, budget line of a consumer consists of all possible combinations of the two commodities that the consumer can purchase with his limited income. Because even though all points on an indifference curve are open to a consumer to enjoy or to derive satisfaction, the level of satisfaction that is open to the consumer to enjoy, or the pleasure he can get, is limited by what his income can get him. It's limited by his income. And that is what introduces what we call the budget constraint. So the budget line of a consumer consists of all possible combinations of the two commodities that the consumer can purchase with a limited budget. Okay, we'll see that shortly. Budget constraint depends on income of the consumer and prices of the commodities in the consumption basket, and mathematically is defined as the price of a commodity X multiplied, or the product of the price and quantity of a commodity X plus the product of the price and the price of a commodity and its quantity Y is equal to the income M, or what is also referred to as the budget constraint. Now, we use two commodities here for the ease of analysis. It can extend to as many commodities as possible. So you can have commodity 1, commodity 2, where your M would now be equal to P1 Q1 plus P2 Q2 plus P3 Q3 up till when you get to Pn Qn, depending on the number of commodities under analysis. But for the ease of analysis, we make use of just two commodities. Now, in this equation, Px is the price of commodity X, Qx the quantity of commodity X, Py the price of commodity Y, Qy the quantity of commodity Y, and M is the income of the consumer. Now, for equilibrium, the conditions for the consumer's equilibrium or for utility maximization: first, the consumer spends all his income, because we are talking about two commodities here for the ease of analysis. So the consumer spends all of his income on just these two commodities. Okay? In buying the two commodities, hence the point of his equilibrium must be along his budget line or within the limit of his income. The point of his equilibrium will be along the budget line or within the limit of his income. After all, the consumer cannot spend beyond the income that is available to him. Therefore, the point at which he derives his maximum satisfaction is where he has spent all of his income on the commodities that we are talking about. So in this case, commodity X and Y. And we also saw earlier on that the highest satisfaction available to the consumer is at the highest indifference curve that is possible for him. Therefore, the point of utility maximization for the consumer, given the budget constraint, is the tangent of the budget constraint or income line and the indifference curve that provides the highest maximum satisfaction. This is the highest possible curve attainable by the consumer subject to his budget constraint, like we saw. So, however, the budget line may shift outwards, upwards or downwards due to any change in income, of course. So the income of the consumer could change. If the income of the consumer changes, it means the budget line shifts. If it increases, it shifts outwards. If it reduces, it shifts inwards. Okay? And also, it can swivel around a particular point if the price of any of the commodity changes. So there are two things involved here: the budget line or the income of the consumer, the budget constraint, and the price of either one of the commodities. So let's look at the graphical representation of all we have said so far. We have indifference curves IC1, IC2, IC3, and IC4. Based on what we said earlier on, this consumer facing these budget lines will enjoy his highest level of satisfaction on the indifference curve IC4, which is the highest indifference curve that is available to him. However, this consumer is faced by one constraint: his income. Therefore, at what point will he enjoy the highest possible satisfaction? Or at what point will he be at equilibrium? Or at what point will utility have been maximized for this consumer? We said that that point is where his budget line is tangential to his indifference curve. And what we see here is that the budget line AB is tangential to indifference curve IC3 at point E. We therefore conclude that the highest satisfaction that is available to this consumer is at point E, where the quantity of good X is QX and the quantity of good Y or commodity Y is QY. Now, what we are saying here is that within the budget constraint, all the points here, any point inside of the budget constraint on the budget line are feasible. So any point here, but this, if we take any point on this particular indifference curve, the consumer is not maximizing satisfaction because his income is higher than this indifference curve, is beyond this indifference curve. And take note that we said that the consumer has to expend the totality of his income on deriving satisfaction or utility. So on the line itself, we have this point here, point C, for example, where the consumer can also enjoy satisfaction. However, at point C, we are crossing the budget constraint at a lower indifference curve, which is IC2. Note again that we already said that satisfaction is highest at a higher indifference curve. So IC1 doesn't work for us because our income is higher. IC2 will not work, even though we have intersection between the budget line and the indifference curve at point C and D, but it doesn't give us the highest level of satisfaction. The only point that gives us that is at point E. So point C and D are feasible but on lower indifference curves, just like I explained, and IC2 and IC1, which is rationality assumption. The rationality assumption says that we believe that the consumer is a rational being. He's going to make the best decision for himself that will give him the highest satisfaction possible, or he's going to try to derive as much utility as is possible within his means, and his means now is the budget constraint. Now the area beyond the budget line, AB, is infeasible. It's not possible because this area is beyond the budget or the income of the consumer. All right? Therefore, we say equilibrium is attained at point E, where AB is tangent to the indifference curve IC3. That's the highest attainable indifference curve as far as feasibility is concerned that means within the budget constraint of the consumer. Equilibrium quantities of commodities X and Y are therefore QX and QY. So, if you say which combination of commodities give this consumer the highest level of satisfaction, it is that combination of the goods X and Y where the indifference curve, the highest feasible indifference curve, is tangential to the consumer's budget line. Having looked at how to arrive at utility maximization or the level of highest satisfaction available to a consumer using the ordinal approach, which does not support the measurability of utility, we have seen that that position is attained where the budget constraint or the income of the consumer gives the highest level of satisfaction with the indifference curve available to him, and that point is reached when the income line or the budget line is tangential to the indifference curve. So the different questions here says we explain utility maximization under ordinal approach. It is expected here that first you explain what the ordinal approach means. The ordinal approach, as different from the cardinal approach, is simply the approach that measures utility or that determines utility maximization without measuring utility like any other physical product. It is the cardinal approach that measures utility in utils. The ordinal approach says utility cannot be measured like a physical commodity or any physical item, but can rather be ranked because it is essentially a psychological feeling. So you can talk about a case where you get better utility or more utility from good A or at this level of consumption of commodity A compared to at that level of consumption. Then it says write short notes on indifference curves. To write short notes of indifference curve, you have to define what an indifference curve is and mention its properties. And then use a diagram to show what an indifference curve is. And we did say that the definition of an indifference curve is as a locus of points that shows the different combinations that offers the same utility to a consumer. The locus of different points that shows the various combinations of two commodities that give the same level of satisfaction to a consumer. And then its properties include the fact that the indifference curve is downward sloping, which is based on the law of marginal utility. It is convex to the origin when you draw it on a graph. The higher the indifference curve, the higher the level of satisfaction. And then, okay, I've mentioned the fact that you have to show it on a graph and show the way it slopes. We have come to the end of this session. If you have questions, observations, or comments to make, kindly do so on our social media handle as displayed on the screen. Thank you.
you.